So each time you want to teach climate science and related things, there's always a need to track the latest advances, new findings, and so on. So in each course, I'm trying to add a list of podcasts at the end called New Findings. This is under Climate and Human Evolution, and as I've said many times in the podcasts along the way in this course, there are going to be more and more new findings about new archaeological sites, new interpretations of evidences of human evolution based on advanced techniques, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to mix a few new papers here just to give you a flavor of the kind of timeline changes and other ideas of evolution come along with these newer findings. So this is a paper from Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences, whose significance of the finding as they report is: identifying the earliest members of the genus Homo is crucial for understanding when and where selective pressures resulted in its emergence from a Plio-Pleistocene hominin taxon. Our revision of a large part of the dental fossil record from southern Africa provides evidence suggesting a paucity of Homo remains and indicates increased levels of dental variations in Australopith taxa. Results of the barium calcium and strontium calcium and elemental mapping of enamel and dentine also indicate that some of the purported Homo specimens show a paleoecological signal similar to that of the Australopiths. So it's the idea of when actually the species succession happened, and when the Australopiths then gave way to the Homo lineages before we came to Homo erectus and afterwards. So this is just pushing the timeline back to finding evidences that what we interpreted as Homo lineages and their distribution in Africa, lacking other evidences, it was interpreted to be Homos, but this argues based on these teeth information that maybe they were Australopiths and not so much Homo lineages. Okay, so this is another paper that reports on when bipedalism may actually have evolved. Again, we said that the Plio-Pleistocene transition, maybe Australia, New Guinea moving and blocking the pathway between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and the resulting change in the El Nino from a permanent El Nino to a more episodic El Nino created the aridification of East Africa, changed the vegetation from lush green forests to grasslands and savannas, and this necessitated the running around for food and to escape from predators, which required much longer travel, and this led to bipedalism as opposed to our ancestral primates who are mostly quadrupedal. So using again evidences which we will read here in this abstract, maybe I should read this first. Postcranial evidence of late Miocene hominin bipedalism in Chad. So this pushes the line back, the timeline of bipedalism quite ways back. Bipedal locomotion is one of the key adaptations that define the hominin clade. Clade is basically a number of species that live together and share environmental preferences, habitats, and so on. Evidence of bipedalism is known from postcranial remains of late Miocene hominins as early as 6 million years ago in eastern Africa. Bipedality of Sahelanthropus chakidensis was hitherto inferred about 7 million years ago in Central Africa, Chad, based on cranial evidence. Here we present postcranial evidence of the locomotor behavior of this Sahelanthropus, with new insights into bipedalism at the early stage of hominin evolutionary history. So brain size changes and the spine cranial connections were used to infer bipedalism, whereas this is looking at post-cranial evidence. I'm not going into the details because this goes a little bit away from climate and evolution, so I want to just give you a flavor of what new findings are out there. The original material was discovered at the locality of TM266 of the Taurus Manella fossiliferous area and consists of one left femur or two, right and left ulnae. The morphology of the femur is most parsimonious with habitual bipedality, and the ulnae preserve evidence of substantial arboreal behavior. So bipedalism would mean mostly on the ground. Arboreal behavior probably require more quadrupedalism. Taken together, these findings suggest that hominins were already bipeds at around 7 million years ago, but also suggest that arboreal clambering was probably a significant part of their locomotor repertoire. So this is the news and views on that article showing timelines. So last common ancestors of chimpanzees and humans, the modern chimp is down here, four-legged walkers and tree climbers. Sahelanthropus that we talked about is here with the femur and the ulnae that we mentioned. Ardipithecus cadabba is here, or in Tugenensis, occasional bipedal walkers and tree climbers, so mixing up their repertoires. Ardipithecus ramidus, and so you're getting here now closer to what we have been looking at. Australopithecus, and then Paranthropus and Homo. So these is Australopithecus afarensis and Homo sapiens, habitual bipedal walkers and occasional tree climbers. So arboreal versus bipedalism is much more different than here. Homogeneous, habitual bipedal walkers, occasional runners, so very different. So the evolution of bipedalism then, hominins, species more closely related to humans than to chimpanzees, evolved from an ancestor shared with the African great apes such as chimpanzees and gorillas, which move by walking on four legs and climbing trees. Sahelanthropus chacadensis is the oldest known hominin species. It has features that suggest that it was an occasional bipedal walker, including leg bone characteristics too subtle to see on the scale of this femur image here, that Dever et al. Report that we looked at. The authors indicate that arm bones, not shown here, of this species were adapted for tree climbing. So we are looking at bipedalism versus arboreal lifestyle. Similar mix of adaptations for occasional bipedal walking and tree climbing characterizes early hominins of the genus Ororin and Ardipithecus. Species of the genus Australopithecus were comparatively more effective habitual bipedal walkers, but retained adaptations for climbing trees, the kind of hands and claws we would have. Species in the genus Homo have numerous adaptations for effective bipedal walking and for running, but have lost most of the adaptations for tree climbing. Femur images are not shown at the relative scale. Note that the Sahelanthropus femur is missing joints at the end of the bone, which would have provided insight into how the species moved. So some interpretation is involved based on the limited evidence. Okay, so let's move now into the Holocene, just as an additional piece of new finding in the same podcast. This talks about where the Indo-European language and the mix of genetic materials and haplogroups and evolved. The so-called Southern Arc is argued to be the important one here, with most of the origins coming from the Yamnaya culture here. The caption of this figure goes something like this: many partings, many meetings, how migration and admixture drove early language spread. Westward and northward migrations out of the West Asian highlands split the Proto-Indian Anatolian language into Anatolian and Indo-European branches. Yamnaya pastoralists formed on the steppe by a fusion of newcomers and locals, admixed again as they expanded far and wide, splitting the Proto-Indian European language into its daughter languages across Eurasia. Border colors represent here the ancestry and locations of 5 source populations before the migrations and mixtures documented here. So you're looking at about 3000 before Common Era, Proto-Indo-Europeans in the Yamnaya culture, which then went off with these different admixtures into Northwest Europe and to the Altai Mountains. So this is the so-called Southern Arc, spreading into West Asia from Africa before going in this direction in the previous podcast that we've been looking at. So here are the Balkans, and you can see the various mixes. Anatolian Neolithic, Levantine, changing here to Caucasus hunter-gatherers. Okay, so I won't go too deeply into those, just want to point out that this is considered kind of the source of genetic materials. We will see that these were a couple of thousand years before this. They were also considered murderous and genocide committers based on a mass grave that's found somewhere in Hungary that is a mix of different groups, bludgeoned or some violence involved in killing them and burying them. So Greece around 1500 to 1000 BCE, Anatolia around 4500 to 1300 BCE. So you can see some older population here. Some migrants before, traces of Anatolian Levantine ancestry. So a lot of the mixing going on this way as well. And Armenia 2000 to 1000 BCE. So the genetic history of the Southern Arc, around 7000 to 5000 years ago, people with ancestry from the Caucasus in the bluish colors moved west into Anatolia and north into the steppe. Some of these migrants may have spoken ancestral forms of Anatolian and Indo-European languages, and these colored blue and red arrows indicate beginning around 5000 years ago. Yamnaya expansions introduced Eastern European ancestry, which is the red, west into the Balkans and Greece, and east across the Caucasus into Armenia here. However, they made no detectable impact on Anatolia. So you can see the red is missing in here. You have the other three colors. So the conclusion of the big paper is that all ancient Indo-European speakers can be traced back to the Yamnaya culture, whose southward expansions into the Southern Arc left a trace in the DNA of the Bronze Age people of the region. However, the link connecting the Proto-Indo-European speaking Yamnaya with the speaking of Anatolian languages was in the highlands of West Asia, the ancestral region shared by both the Anatolians and the Yamnaya. Okay. Other paper argues that the expansion of the Yamnaya was made possible because of dairying. So this is a map showing sites that yielded individuals with preserved ancient proteins. Without going too much into details, you can see the timelines here. So this is mentioned here. So A to C, Neolithic, early Bronze and Middle Late Bronze ages, the sites coming from Pontic Caspian region, showing the number of individuals with positive dairy identification out of the total number of individuals with preserved ancient proteins for each site. Strong evidence of the preservation of equine or ruminant milk protein identifiers are depicted with the black animal icons. The single individual with equivocally identified casein in peptides is shown with a gray icon. Some of them you can see here. Okay, so in other words, the argument here is that dairying practice expanded into the steppe and allowed the Yamnaya cultures to spread out. I won't go into the details of why they are considered the most murderous of the ancestors during the Holocene, Bronze Age, before that Copper Age, and so on. But just want to give you that there are lots of debates about the origin of Indo-European languages and the Indo-European Anatolian languages. This paper argues that most of the source material for that would have come from the Yamnaya culture in the steppe regions. Whether they left their genetic fingerprints by being murderous invaders, or whether there are other ways of cooperative expansion is not something I'm going to get into here, but just a few papers mixed together to give you a sense of how new findings keep coming along in this climate and evolution story. Okay.